Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, today I meet the author. We're going to be talking with Rick Tuers. He's a local photographer and author. We're going to be talking about his book, Lighthouses of New York State. So welcome, Rick.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Now, before we start talking about the book, I thought we would get a little short biography of you so people know who you are and get a sense of, I guess, where you're coming from and all that. So,
Well, I've been in the Capital Region since 1979. I currently work for Department of Environmental Conservation, and I do coastal engineering. And I've been a photographer probably for about 45 years. And I enjoy the outdoors, and I certainly like being near the water. And when I discovered lighthouses about 20 years ago, this was sort of a fascination, and I like to travel, so it sort of kind of fell hand in hand. I got to travel and start to photograph the lighthouses in New Jersey and when I traveled around New York.
but is that traveling for work? I mean, if you're a coastal engineer out in Albany, you must have to travel a lot.
Well, the work with DEC is fairly recent.
Oh, okay.
So I had the love of lighthouses before I got hired as an engineer for DEC. So it was kind of a good marriage of my passion, as a coastal engineer.
So then you said 20 years ago you got interested in lighthouses, and I know you're from New Jersey. Now, how did this start, I guess you could say, or how did this...
Well,
and
there was I had a chance to go out to Montauk Point, and I took a couple of photos of Montauk Point Lighthouse. And about a year and a half later, I was up in Mystic, Connecticut on vacation, and I discovered Ross Holland's book, America's Lighthouses, and it basically has a good history on the lighthouses, and it shows lighthouses everywhere along the coastline. I said, wow, this is kind of cool. And having traveled to the coast many times in my coastal vacations, I really never made a conscious effort to seek out the lighthouses. So it was sort of like this picture, and then a year and a half later, there was light bulb went off and said they're all everywhere. So I started to make an effort to seek them out and photograph them.
now, you wouldn't think there's, in New York State, there's like, what, 70?
71.
I know, you wouldn't think that. More than the state of Maine, which is in your book. But,
Right.
So tell me about this, is it pharology, Pharology? This is what, the study of lighthouses, or the...
Right, right.
Okay, is
yeah.
that, so you'd say you're a pharologist? Is that...
Something like that, yeah, just fascination with the lighthouses.
Now, what do you think, why do you think there's a fascination with that? The reason I'm asking is, before we started today, I was looking in books in print.
Right.
And there's there's about 200 books currently in print on lighthouses. And
Right.
I think we probably all know lighthouse aficionados. I think my office mate has half his room has got pictures of lighthouses, little knickknacks,
Right.
And what do you think the fascination is? Since you're one, you could...
Well, I think people like the coast as a destination, and generally the lighthouses are on coastal waters, whether it be shorelines of the Atlantic, Pacific, or inland like the Hudson or the Great Lakes. So it's a fun destination. There are lots of other things to do there. I think there's the history is kind of a bygone era. In other words, the lighthouses are past their peak. They're no longer necessary, but they still do function as lighthouses and aids navigation. So I think there's that mystique of 100, 150, 200 years ago, how people traveled and how people navigated and how people found their way, around America and in through New York State.
Well, there's like a romantic quality to it, I think.
Sure.
The solitary, ocean living there. So now, about your book, Lighthouses of New York State. Why don't you tell us about, I already mentioned there's 70. How many, well, tell us a little about New York State and all of them in general, if you could. Like, how many are active, how many are aids in navigation, sort of, I guess, their replacement or whatever? Is that?
Well, I don't have the exact number, but roughly between 50 and 75% are active aids to navigation. And what that means is that the Coast Guard is responsible for the light. In other words, it may be owned by a preservation society, the building itself, but the light itself is the Coast Guard is responsible for maintaining it. So these are actually listed in the Coast Guard's what they call light list, and this is an official listing of where all the buoys and lights are, so that mariners can understand what the shorelines look like and where the lights are, and how they function.
Now, are any still, what's the word? Do people still live at any?
The only lighthouse in America that's actively manned is the first lighthouse, and that was the Boston Light.
That's the only one in the whole country?
Right.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there are Coast Guard stations in proximity to some of the lighthouses. For example, Eaton's Neck is a Coast Guard facility with several boats, but the lighthouse just basically sits there and is fully automated.
Okay. Now, the one thing about your book was, in the beginning here, you mentioned there's like, I counted, there's about 12 different kinds, wooden tower, concrete, screw pile. What in New York State are these like the most common kind, and are these, that was more a historical part in that book?
Yeah, I tried to give you a little sense on the engineering, the different types that exist, kind of throughout the world. Generally in New York State, there are basically two types. In a general sense, you have the coastal lights, the tall lights, where you can see them maybe 15, 20 miles out to sea, like Fire Island and Montauk Point. And then you have the smaller towers, or maybe possibly a house that a family would live at, and the keeper would be there and maintain. So they're not of the high. Most of the lighthouses in New York State are of a smaller variety. What I'm saying.
Well, I noticed the ones in here, the pictures in the Hudson and the Lake Champlain. They were like they're like half houses, half, and then all the coast ones were shore ones. I mean, tower kind of like. So
That's correct.
And one thing in the book that I found the most interesting, really, and then you were telling me about this, and something I didn't know. Every lighthouse, wherever it is, they all have their beacon, their signal, whatever you want to call it, is totally unique, and then they keep a list. Tell us about that. I found that really...
Well, as I was mentioning a couple minutes ago, the Coast Guard maintains a light list of where all the beacons are, and so they have the coordinates, and then what the elevation of them are, and then what the flashing sequence. In other words, the potential colors are white, red, and green.
Mm-hmm.
So, as an example, it could be a white light that flashes for 3 seconds on, and then off for 2, and then back on for 3. So that's one characteristic. It could be green and do the same thing, so it would be different. So every light has specific characteristics that make it unique, kind of like your fingerprint.
So then, and then these lists, the mariners, the sailors know, where 3, 2, 1, whatever, that's Montauk, or that's that, and every single one is different.
Right.
That's really interesting.
Right.
So, so now tell us, the one thing you're telling me, because you've worked full time, and this book took 16 years, so, and obviously you had to go all over the state. What I don't know. Did you have? How did you get? Did you do it like part time, or did you just went to Lake Champlain one day? How did that all work out?
It required a lot of separate
I was
trips.
going to say.
It's just really a lot of different, and some cases I've had to go back and retrace my steps because the quality the first time out wasn't as good as I wanted. So I had to go back out and reshoot some of these.
Now, from a lot of these, how did you, how did you get to some of these? I know some of these you can drive up to, the shore ones. Some of them, I don't know. Tell us how you got to some of these. I'm sure you probably have some adventures getting them.
Well, it's quite interesting. I'm just to kind of give you the facts. 29 of the 71 lighthouses are located on man-made or natural islands.
Okay.
So water was everywhere, and I don't own a boat.
Oh, okay.
So what I do own is a kayak, and I've kayaked to some. But I guess I've relied on the generosity of others, such as the Coast Guard and the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and friends of friends to take me out to some of these lights. I mean, Galoo Island, which is the most remote lighthouse in New York State, I think it's like 16 miles from Sackett's Harbor, and there's no way I would have ever found it, let alone got there. So we were able to go out and we looked at Horse Island and Charity Shoal and Galoo Island, all in one trip. But it required, a lot of coordination and the generosity.
Oh, I know. In the pictures in some of these, you can sort of tell you're way out there in the middle of. And you had a very interesting story about, I forgot the name of the lighthouse, but 3 weeks after 9/11, there was. Tell us about that one.
Oh, that was. Let me see, which one was that? That was. I think that was Old Orchard Shoal. Yeah, actually on 9/11, I was scheduled to take off the 11th. I had a meeting in the Bronx on the 10th, and I stayed with somebody in Coney Island, and I was going over to Staten Island to photograph what was the balance of my inventory for the New York State lighthouses. And needless to say, I didn't do the photo shoot on 9/11. I basically just worked my way back to Albany, later in the afternoon. And I went back out 3 weeks later to the Old Orchard. Let's see. I went back and I met with some folks from the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and they took me out into New York City Harbor. And at the time, New York City Harbor was closed to all commercial traffic. I think it was for about 2 months. So the picture that I have of Old Orchard Light is with a sailboat. There was a sailboat race going
That is
on.
one of the nicest pictures in here, yes. And people will be seeing that. So.
Okay.
So, no, what were we saying, that there was the sailboat in the picture?
Well, it just, it was kind of neat. It was just, we were the only powerboat, and there was nothing but sailing craft out there at the time.
So there was no, was the harbor closed right after 9/11? Oh, okay. So
Yeah, it was closed for about 2 months.
So you were on a Coast Guard.
Coast Guard auxiliary boat.
Okay. Well, now, why don't we talk about some of the lighthouses closer to us here in Albany? There are several in the Hudson River. I guess the closest would be down near Hudson, New York. So tell us about some of those, and we'll be seeing pictures of those. Tell us about some of those.
Okay. Did you want to talk about historic Montauk?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, why don't we do that one first? I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah.
Because that was the one that got you going on the.
Yeah, Montauk was and we have a picture of, I think it's an 1878 photo of Montauk Lighthouses. I think I got this from the Historical Society. It's an older black and white photo that shows the bluff there, Turtle Hill. And it's the most easterly point in New York State. You're just a few miles from Block Island. And it's very, very, quaint and kind of laid back, and it's not like the Hamptons. It's just kind of a nice area out there. And the lighthouse itself is owned by the Montauk Historical Society, and they're a very dedicated group to preserving the lighthouse, and they've done a good job. And it's our oldest light. It was originally commissioned by George Washington. His 9th piece of legislation was to create the lighthouse establishment. So that was basically the original agency for the lighthouses in America. And through this lighthouse establishment legislation, there were a dozen lighthouses that were constructed prior to George Washington's death, and Montauk was one of those 12.
Okay, so these go back to the 1700s. That's right, it was in the beginning.
Right. Montauk was completed in 1796.
Okay. Now you have several of that one. And then moving a little bit on, staying on Long Island for 1 second, I only want to ask you about this one because Fire Island, it not only adorns the cover, but you have more, I think, pictures of the Fire Island one than, there's like 3 pages of that one. Why so many of that one? Is that I know it's the tallest and all that, but that's the one you have the most of it here. Why is there so many of that one? Any particular reason? Or?
Well, we had, I had the privilege with the publisher of being able to select all the images that I wanted to include in the book. They gave me that opportunity. I submitted about 350 images, and they said, well, we'd like you to select the final one. So basically I had narrowed down what I thought were my favorites, and they included all my favorites in the book, which was kind of neat.
Yeah.
Not a lot of times you don't have that flexibility
Yeah.
when you do a book. So Fire Island is kind of an interesting light. This is actually the second light on that location, and this one that's on the cover is actually going to be celebrating its 150th birthday next November 1st. And it's just an amazing feat. I mean, it's built of bricks. And
I
you
think
look
it said there was, what, 800,000 bricks? or something?
800,000 bricks to create this. I think it's something like 5 feet thick in the base, and then it tapers down to about 3 feet at the top, you know, in the thickness of the brick. And it's what they call a wave swept. In other words, if a wave came by, you would just kind of curl up near the edge of it.
Okay.
But I don't think waves have ever gotten even close to that lighthouse.
How, is it on the coast? Is it in? It's inland, right?
Well, it's on Fire Island. It's on the
Oh, that's
Barrett.
right. It's an island. Okay.
And interestingly enough, when the lighthouse was constructed, it was basically at the inlet. Now the inlet, just by the natural sand drift, has migrated 3.5 miles to the west. So in about 150, 175 years, the sand spit has grown 3.5 miles longer.
Well, I notice in the Montauk, I should say that in all your lighthouses here, besides the picture, there's a page or two on the history of each lighthouse, which is very informative. On the Montauk one, you were mentioning, what was it? It was 300 feet from shore when it was built, and now it's like 50 feet away, or what was the numbers on that again? Because of erosion, or?
Yeah, when it was originally constructed in the 1700s, 1795, 1796, it was about 300 feet
From the shore.
From the shore.
Okay.
And it's basically, you have to kind of picture that it's on a bluff, this Turtle Hill, and you have to get the Atlantic Ocean. And what's happened is the bluff has gradually eroded, and now it's only about 45 feet from the base.
Oh, okay.
And that's been a huge concern. And it's been a football has been tossed back and forth because the property was owned by the Coast Guard up until about 1993 or 1994, and it changed hands, and now it's owned by the Historical Society. And typically these type of projects are done by the Army Corps of Engineers.
Mm-hmm.
So the Army Corps of Engineers couldn't do the work on the Coast Guard property for whatever reasons.
No, that's probably.
So now it's in the Historical Society's it's owned by them, and so they did a temporary project out there in '95, and it was about a cost of about $5 million, and it had a service life of about 12 or 13 years, and we're starting to see some failure to that. And what we're looking at now is to build a stronger stone revetment around the base of the bluff that'll give us something like a 100-year service life out of it and protect it, long term.
Now, most of these lighthouses are they run by these preservation groups? That's what it seemed like from reading the.
Yeah, in general, I'd say probably about 75–80% are owned by preservation groups.
And they have to depend on contributions. Is that?
Yes.
That must be.
Yeah, it's huge, particularly with the Fire Island, Montauk Point. There are a lot of maintenance with these coastal lights that are really being hammered by the fog and the wind and the storms of the Atlantic.
But you can go. These are all open to the public to visit, are they?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. All the non-for-profit historical societies do offer some opportunities. Some of them are not as frequent as others, but like Montauk, basically from Memorial Day on, it's open every day, and they do have some winter hours. Fire Island, same thing. The ones that are owned by the smaller groups that don't have full-time staff and it's all volunteers, then it usually becomes limited, and summertime is usually the only time to access.
Okay, so now maybe we could talk about some of the Hudson River ones.
Sure.
Closer to home here.
Sure.
Tell us about some of those. I think there was there's 7 in the Hudson, but
Right.
talk about some of the ones sort of close to Albany in case people might want to.
Well, my home, I call my home light, and that means it's kind of the one that's close to home to me, and that's down at Hudson Athens. I support them financially, and I also give tours down there.
But you're also on their board or something, or the
No,
member?
I'm
Okay.
just an active volunteer.
So you give tours of that one. That's the one that looks like a house in the middle of the.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that was finished in 1876, and it's kind of a family light. Family lived there, and it's got a main floor with a kind of a kitchen and a sitting room and a living room, and then you go upstairs, and there's there's 4 bedrooms, I believe, and then you go up another level, and then you have the lamp and the lens.
And this lighthouse was on the cover of the New York Post, the Saturday Evening Post magazine, back in the 30s or the 40s.
Yeah, I think that was what was the date on that? I think that was December 28th,
Oh, okay.
1946.
And there's a picture of that we'll be seeing.
Interesting little story on that. There's a little bit of artistic license with that cover, and I don't know if they'll put it up in a second or if they put it up. But with it, there's a picture of, and I know the family, it's the Brunner family. Emil Brunner was rowing the boat out with a Christmas tree, and his son was in the boat with him. So that part was good. But the angle that they're going in at the lighthouse, they have some features that don't jive. In other words, they have a feature from this side of the light being thrown on the front of the cover. And the other part that's kind of interesting, it shows the one son in the boat, and I think there's 4 on the landing with mom, and they only had 3 kids.
Okay.
So they threw a little extra in there.
And then this one down in Hudson is people can go visit, and it's open to the public. And then what, Saugerties? There's one in Saugerties. Is that?
Saugerties is one of the 4 bed and breakfast, or 4 places you can visit as a lighthouse
Okay.
and stay at.
It's a bed and breakfast. Okay.
Yes.
And what other ones would sort of be closer to us? I guess are they the only?
Well, those are the 2 that are closest.
Okay.
And then further down is the Rondout, which is in Kingston. There's a maritime museum there, and you can take a boat out to the light there. And actually, you can actually, when you take the boat out, you can go by the Rondout and also go down to the next one, which is the Esopus Meadows.
Okay. Okay, we're going to talk about a few more of the Hudson River lighthouses. Esopus Meadows, is that how you say that?
Esopus Meadows.
Okay, tell us about that one and some of the.
Well, it's just a little bit further south of the Rondout in Kingston, and it's affectionately known as the Maid of the Meadows. It's kind of neat. It sits in the Hudson River estuary, and what's cool about it, the backdrop of the Catskills is just magnificent. And it's actually been a struggle for the Historical Society there to restore it, but they've, it was an uphill battle, and they've done a great job. I really commend them for all the work that they've done there. It's the only wooden lighthouse on the Hudson River. And
The only wooden one?
wooden one, yeah. And so you just got to imagine a wood structure in the middle of the water.
I know.
This doesn't mix. I don't know why they ever put a wooden structure there, but they did, and it was in really rough shape about 10 years ago when I got to visit it. In fact, the photos that I took were taken about 10 years ago, and I've since spoken with some of the folks there. Just actually last week I met them, and they've done a wonderful job, so I want to get back down there to reshoot that one. It's a great light.
And then what's Stony Point? Is that just another
Yeah,
one?
yeah, Stony Point is actually a state park. There was actually a battle there prior to the construction of the light. And actually, Stony Point is our oldest Hudson River light. It was constructed in 1826, a year after the Erie Canal was opened. And really was part of that new influx of traffic that was coming up and down the Hudson River and then going out to Buffalo. It actually sits on a bluff, so it's not a very tall light, but because it's on this large bluff, it has that advantage of being able to be seen from a long distance. So it's kind of a neat spot to have a picnic or go down for the day.
And again, as I said before, most of these places you could do something like have a picnic at all these.
Yeah, that one actually they got a little museum with it.
Oh, okay.
That's run by the state parks.
And then the Tarrytown one, is it near Sleepy Hollow of the
Yeah, it's actually owned by the village of Sleepy Hollow.
Washington Irving fame?
Yeah. They want to actually rename the light Sleepy Hollow light, but Tarrytown light is sort of stuck. But yeah, when you travel across the Tappan Zee Bridge.
Is this the one that's only like 10 feet tall, or is that a different one?
No, that's Jeffrey's Hook.
Okay.
That's a little further south.
Okay.
That's the next one we'll talk about. This one is a cast iron pile. Basically, they dropped in the river. It's a metal tube, varying diameter tube.
And this is down near the Tappan Zee Bridge? You can
Yeah,
see? Okay.
yeah, it's red and white. It's actually a pretty spot. The picture that I took of it was from the south, looking out into the river across to the Palisades in the springtime. So the trees were in bloom, and I think there was a barge, a Blue Circle cement barge coming up the river. It was just kind of a neat spot. And actually, the lighthouse is adjacent to the old General Motors plant, which has been demolished. And they are going to be redoing the whole site, redeveloping it, cleaning it up, and they're going to be creating it into a development called Lighthouse Landing, which is kind of cool. And you could, and you're standing on the Tarrytown Light. You can see New York City in the background. You can see the skyline. You can see the Empire State Building. You can see the Chrysler Building and the George Washington Bridge. And underneath the George Washington Bridge is the Jeffries Hook Light.
Okay.
And that's kind of an interesting story. The lighthouse was there first. Actually, to back up, the Jeffries Hook Light was originally down in Sandy Hook. They took it out of service, and they brought it up to New York and put it there on the Hudson River. And then when the bridge was constructed, they removed it. And a woman wrote a book.
A children's book, right?
Children's book.
Okay,
It was called the Little Red Lighthouse and the Great Gray Bridge. And this was basically to raise the sentiment to replace the light, put it back next to the bridge. And Robert Moses at the time was the Parks Commissioner, and there was a lot of politics, whatever. And basically, it was enough pressure to get them to put the light back underneath.
So this little children's book saved the...
Save the lighthouse. Which is
I
kind
know
of cool.
that's in your book. That is a nice story.
Yeah.
Well, what kind of people, like you talk about these preservation groups that work at all these places. What kind of people are they? Are they just history buffs, lighthouse buffs? Are they just people interested in preserving the past, or
I think
is there
it's
a certain type?
I think it's all of that and then some. I mean, the people that I've met in the preservation groups have a sincere dedication. They're down-to-earth people that want to see the history preserved for future generations. These are kind of the pearls, of New York State, and they're an intricate part of our past. It basically allowed us to get to where we are today through the settlement, colonization, and development, industrialization of New York. We've come a long way, and it all goes back to the maritime history and the navigation, and just bringing people, goods, and property to settle New York and America. And we were the door. When the Erie Canal, once the Erie Canal opened up, it really opened the floodgates to allow New York to be an integral part of it. And these lighthouses were the way to find.
To get up to go to the Erie Canal.
Yeah. So it's it's a wonderful story, that I try and tell about the people, about the lighthouses. I have a chapter in there on the lost beacons, those that are along over there, and I talk a little about the families, and I try and make the book a kind of a user-friendly how to get to the lighthouses. And in my appendices, I've got.
I was going to say in the back you have listed all the preservation groups, the
Right.
maritime museums, the websites of all these groups. People can, find more information about them.
Yeah, hopefully it's a good resource to everyone to enjoy the lighthouses of New York.
Well, obviously we're not covering everything, but besides Hudson and Long Island and New York City, we talked about a few. There's also a section in here on Lake Champlain,
Right.
and then I think the biggest section is St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes. There's 30 or so?
About 26 lighthouses on Lake Erie. This is in New York. Lake Erie, Niagara River, Lake Ontario, and the St. Lawrence Seaway.
And then Lake Champlain has, I didn't know until I was looking at your book, Lake Champlain is the 6th largest lake in America. I didn't know that.
Right.
And many shipwrecks. You wouldn't think of shipwrecks on that, but place. Well, you're going to be in the area at many different places. I thought I'll tell people where you're going to be, and you can explain when you give your presentations at either a library or you're going to be down at the Albany Institute. What is it that you do or talk about, and what do you show slides, and then I'll tell people sort of where you're going to be over the next few months.
Well, I try to make it a fun event. We're having a little bit of an exchange of ideas and what people understand about lighthouses, and then try and direct my talk to their interest, whether it's the history or about the people or the maritime history.
And you show your own pictures?
Yeah, I show some pictures from the book, the different lighthouses, and I try to interact, with the folks. And of course, we'll have the book available, for those, and just have a fun time.
Okay, so I'll tell people you're going to be down at and a lot of these events are in daytime and night, so if you can always get there, some people, if you're working or not. The Hudson River Maritime Museum down in Kingston on October 23rd at 7 o'clock at night. You're going to be at the Albany Institute of History and Art on November 3rd at 1 in the afternoon. And then you're going to be at many different libraries next year. January 18th at the Clifton Park Library, the Guilderland Library on January 29th, Bethlehem Library on February 10th. We're going to have you here. We haven't set it up yet, but Rick's going to be at our library too. You're going to be down at the State Museum on January 23rd, and what's that, like a lunchtime thing?
Right,
12:15.
Right.
And you'll be showing slides and talking about, the history. And then, what else was I going to ask you? RickTours.com has a lot of stuff about your work, and I guess I should ask you, besides Lighthouses, what other kind of photography?
Well, being in the outdoor setting, there's a lot of great opportunities to take scenics, whether they're sunsets or sunrises. I've traveled through Canada, United States, and Mexico, and it certainly presented some, great canvases to capture. And while I'm in there, there's also the wildlife that sort of pops up. So I've started to include those in my website.
So is there another book in the future after the Lighthouse book with all the nature?
Yeah, there's lots of choice, lots of opportunities.
Okay. Well then, Rick, thanks for being here. I meet the author today. We appreciate it. For people watching, when Rick's going to be at our library, if you're a regular here, look at our newsletter. Rick will be here maybe in, I don't know, December or January sometime, giving the full array of his slides and talking about lighthouses. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Okay.